Welcome to the Night Library, and tonight we'll be reading chapters 9 and 10 of Funhouse. Chapter 9. She went to the police with my poem. I was watching. I watched her house all night. Silly girl. The police probably think she's Looney Tunes. Laughed at her, I bet. Have to hand it to her, though. I thought she'd split when she got my note. She didn't. Stayed right there. Had every light in the condo on, though. The place looked like one giant light bulb. She stayed at Gambone's last night. Okay by me. Plenty of time after all. A few weeks ago, I didn't even know what I know now. Until I read Leela O'Hare's journal. After that bunch of blank pages, following the entry about losing the boardwalk, she began writing again. My Tully is gone. I know what people are saying, that what he did was cowardly, but Tully was no coward. He did it for me and the baby. He didn't know, that poor sweet man, that the insurance company wouldn't pay off in a suicide case. How am I going to take care of our baby when it comes? The man was dead. That was pretty gruesome. I wondered if those guys who took the boardwalk from him felt guilty. Maybe not. I knew what my own father would say. He'd say, look, the guy couldn't hack it. Is that my fault? Well, yes, actually. I guess it could have been, if my father had been in on the deal. I hoped he hadn't. But after all, the journal was in this trunk, in the attic, in this house, and I had a sneaking suspicion that meant something. Leela went on. Buddy came to see me. He said I shouldn't worry, that he'd take care of everything, that they all felt guilty about buying the boardwalk, that they never thought it would drive Tully to suicide. They didn't buy the boardwalk, they stole it. But I have to let Buddy help me. I have no choice. She was going to let this creep help her out. After what he'd done, but she must really be desperate. Little tiny hammers tattooing the inside of my skull made me put down the journal. Chapter 10. When Tess went home the next day, Gina insisted she take one of the Gamboni cats with her. For company, she said. Take Trilby. She's the most affectionate. She is a thing for laps and she loves to be petted. You can keep her until Shelley gets back. Is Trilby trained as an attack cat? Tess joked, in an effort to calm the nerves that were stretched taut from uncertainty and lack of sleep. What had that purple note meant? Who had written it, and why? Had it really been just a sick joke? The cat was beautiful, a sleek Siamese with clear blue eyes. She purred with gratitude when she was allowed to lounge in Tess's lap all the way home. Tess had barely had time to change into jeans and a yellow sweatshirt when the phone rang. It was Gina. Listen, I know you're not going to be crazy about this idea, she warned, but just hear me out, okay? My dad asked me this morning if I could get a bunch of kids together to go to the boardwalk sometime this week, just to show people that it's safe, you know? But is it? Tess wondered. I thought, Gina continued, since we have the day off, this afternoon would be a good time. I've already talked to Beak and Sam, and they think it's a good idea. Sam said he'd called Guy Joe, and I think Trudy and Candace might come too. Trudy told me she was planning to sleep all day, but when I told her Guy Joe was coming, she changed her mind, and Sam said he's bringing Candace. I don't want to go down there, Tess protested. The oval table was still firmly pressed up against the French doors, a reminder that Saturday night's note hadn't been imagined. If the author had something to do with the rollercoaster crash, he might be hanging around the boardwalk, returning to the scene of the crime. Didn't criminals do that sort of thing? Why can't we do something else? Come on, Tess, please. First of all, there isn't anything else to do. Secondly, my dad's worried about what the accident will do to the business on the boardwalk. And I don't blame him. Look, he hardly ever asks me for anything. I don't want to turn him down. Gina's voice took on a stubborn note. I'm going over there this afternoon. You coming? Tess hesitated. Gina's father had always been kind to Tess. If he was really worried, she would help out. Okay, I'll come. What time? Oh, great. Listen. We'll just hang out in the funhouse, okay? No rides. Not when you're so uptight. I wouldn't torture you by forcing you on the dragon's breath or helicopter hell, but the funhouse is perfectly safe. We're meeting at the entrance at 2, but I thought maybe you could pick me up. Sure. The funhouse wasn't always safe, Tess thought grimly. Someone had committed suicide in there. a long time ago, but then it wasn't as if someone had attacked him in there. He'd taken his own life. The funhouse isn't my favourite place to be, Tess said before she hung up, but at least it doesn't have any windows, so it won't have a view of the Devil's Elbow. That's about the only place on the boardwalk that doesn't, so maybe it won't be so grim. Gina laughed. If it was grim, she teased, they'd have to call it the Grim House. And nobody would visit it, and the whole boardwalk would go out of business, and we'd all be poor. Tess hung up, and she realised immediately that she'd forgotten to ask Gina if her father had heard anything about the investigation. The police should know something by now, shouldn't they? She'd asked this afternoon. Beat might have heard something if Gina hadn't. His parents were on the board of directors too, as were Sam's and Trudy's, and Chalmers would probably go to the board with whatever he found before he shared it with the general public. Too bad she couldn't call her own father. Well, it wasn't that she couldn't. She just didn't want to. If she told him how nervous the note had made her, he'd tell her she was being illogical and unreasonable and overreacting. She'd rather find out what she needed to know from Gina or Gajo or any one of her friends. They wouldn't lecture her. Before she left, she gave Trilby a small bowl of water and a dish of the cat food Gina had sent with her. Gina hadn't heard a thing about the investigation, and neither had anyone else. When Tess complained, Sam lifted one dark eyebrow as if to say, "See, what did I tell you?" The rollercoaster frame had been roped off and tagged with large cardboard signs commanding "No entry" and "Stay out" and "Closed for repairs." Everything else on the boardwalk remained open, and just as Mr. Gamboni had feared, few people were taking advantage of the fact. After all, something terrible had happened then. Something terrible could easily happen again. Why take a chance? Tess understood that feeling. It was slinking around in her own head, tugging at her and making it impossible for her to relax. The purple note had mentioned a next, but it hadn't said what to expect, which meant that today couldn't be ruled out, could it? Gina tried to keep everyone's mind off the crash, chatted cheerfully as the group headed for the funhouse. A bright red scarf tied around her dark curls, she trotted purposefully ahead of them, in knee-length red shorts and a red and white flowered skirt. The sight of her, looking as if she hadn't a care in the world, should have perked up Tess's spirits, but it didn't. She had already begun gnawing on the fingernails it had taken her months to grow. She shouldn't have come. Keeping her eyes averted from the silent Devil Elbows frame didn't keep the screams and moans and cries for help from echoing in her head. When she found herself continually looking over her shoulder, consumed by a creepy feeling that someone was watching her. The funhouse was a long, narrow tunnel built in an L shape. The foot of the L built out over the beach and supported by wooden stilts. The dark wooden structure contained several small areas of open railings dividing one passageway from another, where people could momentarily relax and enjoy the scenery and salt air before going on to the next challenge. Tess, her stomach rebelling after conquering the challenges of the rolling wooden walkway, and then tossing and tilting of a moving paddle tunnel, took advantage of the second of these open balconies to catch her breath and settle her insides. Tina, Trudy, and Candace went on ahead to the third event, a nylon-padded tunnel whose footing consisted solely of heavy metal chain links. Tess breathed in the cool air and tried to relax, but it was impossible. She was uncomfortable being anywhere near the boardwalk, and she couldn't stop thinking about the man who had committed suicide in the funhouse. "You sick?" Gajo asked suddenly, coming up beside her. His yellow sweatshirt matched hers, but his complexion wasn't green, as she was sure hers must be. He looked tan and healthy, as always. His stomach was stronger than hers. "Uh-huh, just catching my breath. Go ahead with the others." She should tell him about the note, but if he believed it was really a threat, he'd just tell her to move back in with him and their father, and she didn't want to do that. "Beak's still back there," he said, inclining his head backwards. "He got hung up on the rolling tunnel. He was on the floor as much as he was on his feet, clowning around as usual. Sam went back to give him a hand. "Guy Joe," she said, because she was sick of not talking about it. "Do you think the crash was an accident? Tell the truth." He shrugged. "Who knows? Anything is possible, right? The question is, why would someone do something so awful?" "Yeah," she agreed solemnly. "That is the question." And although her imagination was pretty vivid, she couldn't come up with any reason why someone would commit such a horrible act. Sam and Beat caught up with them a few minutes later. They took a break, relaxing on the balcony briefly, while Beat told a few stupid jokes, and then they all went on together. The hardest part of the funhouse for Tess was always the chamber where there was no solid floor, only a cluster of constantly whirling metal saucers. They were slippery, always moving, and there was nothing to grasp for balance except for the soft, draped black nylon folds on the wall, almost impossible to hold on to no matter how desperately you clutched. She discovered long ago that the only way she could make it across was by lowering herself to a sitting position and scooting from saucer to saucer. It took longer and seriously dented her dignity, but it worked. She was in the process of doing just that when she realized that she wanted very much to go home. She wanted out of this crazy place, with its skeletons rattling and its fake bats flying overhead and its dragon's breath breathing foul-smelling smoke in her face. She was tired of feeling like a fool, arms and legs flailing hopelessly as she tried to keep her balance on moving boards, linked chains, whirling circles, and rubber tires. She'd had enough. Although there were wooden steps exiting the funhouse in several different places, Tess and her friends always chose the steep metal chute that slid directly to the beach. The walkways were for more timid souls. It was fun to sail down to the beach and land on the sand, legs sprawled every which way. With a strong sense of release, Tess did exactly that. Trudy, Candace, and Gina were already comfortably seated on the beach, watching the waves pounding the shore. Beak, Sam, and Guy Joe followed Tess down the chute. "Listen, guys," Tess said as she dusted sand from her jeans. "I'm going to split. My head is cracking right down the middle. I need to sleep." Ignoring Gina's protests, she reached into the back pocket of her jeans and groaned. "My keys are gone," she cried in dismay. "I put my key case in my back pocket so I wouldn't have to lug my purse around with me in there," she said, waving towards the funhouse. "They must have fallen out," she groaned again. "My stomach can't handle that place again, not this soon. It hasn't recovered from that stupid rolling tunnel." Gina stood up. "I'll go. I know your key case, the red leather one with your initials on it, right?" "You'll never find that key case in there," Beak argued. "Get maintenance to look for it." "Why doesn't Tess go herself?" Trudy asked. "They're her keys." "Why don't we all go?" Sam said as Gina turned to leave. "Tess can show us exactly where she did most of her usual acrobatics, so I'll know where the keys would most likely have fallen out of her pocket." "No, that's silly," Gina said, waving a hand in dismissal. "I'll go. I'll be right back. I know the funhouse like the back of my hand," and she added with a grin, "My stomach's cast iron. Everyone knows that." And she turned and ran up the beach. "Where's she going?" asked Doss as he joined them. "To find Tessa's car keys," Trudy answered. "She lost them in the funhouse." "Then why is Gina looking for them?" Doss asked. "For heaven's sake," Tess cried. I'll go. The thought of entering the funhouse again made her sick, but it was true. The keys were hers. She was the one who lost them, and Gina shouldn't have to look for them alone. She turned to follow her up the beach. Entering the funhouse, Tess wondered how they would ever find the keys. The place had so many little nooks and crannies, so many cracks in the wooden floors, and then there were all those open spaces between the whirling circles. The keys might even have fallen through to the beach. If they didn't find the case in here, they'd have to sift through the sand next. "Gina," she called as she entered the rolling wooden walkway and clutched at the padded walls. "Gina, wait up." She had hurried through the tilting tunnel and headed for the first of the open balconies when a sound stopped her in her tracks. It was a piercing scream that sent shivers of ice sliding down her back. That scream wasn't a normal part of the funhouse. It hadn't come from a witch's cackling mouth or a dangling skeleton or a bloody corpse. That scream had been real. The voice had been familiar. Very familiar. Although she didn't want to believe it, the voice had belonged to Gina Gambone. and it hadn't been an "oh gosh, I'm scared" Funhouse kind of scream. Tess could recognize a scream of genuine fear when she heard it. Calling Gina's name, Tess tried desperately to run, but it was impossible, given the footing underneath her as she entered the puffed pillow passageway. She stumbled and several times before reaching solid footing again. Her breath came in ragged gasps, threatening to stick in her throat. Calls to Gina brought only silence in return. Safer, more solid walkways around each challenge brought her quickly to the chamber of metal sources. They were separated by small spaces, through which glimpses of the beach below could be seen. The spaces were so tiny they provided no danger, as only a toothpick-sized person could slip through and fall to the hard-packed sand below, unless one of the large round circles was missing, and one was. Tess stared at the gap in the flooring, her mouth open, eyes wide, as she realized she could see quite clearly to the beach below. She could see the tan sand, flat in some spots, bounded into little hillocks by the wind in other places. She could see a small green plastic pail left by a careless child, and she could see Gina. She was lying on the ground, on the sand, her left leg sticking out at a sickening angle, her face in a profile twisted in agony, and she was lying very, very still.